Beijing, China, September 18, 2025. At the Xiangshan Forum in Beijing, China's Defence Minister Dong Jun took the stage with a speech that underscored Beijing's growing frustration with what it perceives as US dominance and interference in global affairs. His words, carefully chosen but unmistakably pointed, targeted Washington's policies in Asia and beyond. The remarks, delivered in front of a large international audience, were laced with accusations of hegemonic logic and acts of bullying. The forum, held annually in Beijing, is China's most high-profile international defence and security dialogue. It brings together military leaders, government officials and policy experts from across the globe. On this occasion, the atmosphere reflected both rising geopolitical tensions and the weight of regional disputes, particularly in the South China Sea. The event began with choreographed precision. Delegates watched as Dong Jun entered the venue, walking past rows of uniformed officials and representatives from across Asia and beyond. He took his seat before the ceremonial proceedings began, the mood solemn yet anticipatory. As the session opened, senior figures, including Russian Deputy Defence Minister Anna Tsiviliova and ASEAN Secretary-General Cao Kim-hoan, joined the stage, signalling Beijing's intent to showcase its partnerships. Delegations from Myanmar and other regional players emphasised the breadth of attendance, underscoring the forum's role as a platform for China to project influence. When Dong Jun walked to the podium, the room hushed. Cameras zoomed in as the Chinese Defence Minister prepared to deliver a speech that would become one of the most forceful statements heard at this year's forum. Dong Jun said, "The world is currently facing profound changes unseen in a century." While the themes of the times, peace and development, remain unchanged, the gloom of a Cold War mentality, hegemonism and protectionism lingers on, even turning the legacy of World War II into a tool for geopolitical games. The statement, long and deliberate, framed China as a defender of peace and development, while implicitly accusing Western powers, particularly the United States, of clinging to outdated rivalries and leveraging history for political gain. By invoking the memory of World War II, Dong linked present disputes to an enduring struggle over order and legitimacy in global politics. Observers noted that such references are part of China's broader strategy to cast itself as a stabilizing force while portraying others as destabilizers. For Beijing, language like Cold War mentality signals its rejection of US alliances in Asia, which China argues are relics of confrontation rather than partnerships for peace. As his remarks continued, Dong sharpened his tone, directly connecting today's tensions to acts of coercion that China believes undermine stability. Dong Jun stressed, world peace faces new threats and challenges. Historical memory must serve as a constant warning to recognize and oppose hegemonic logic and acts of bullying that are disguised in a new form. Peace and justice should be safeguarded with full strength. The Defence Minister's words were both a warning and a call to action. He urged countries to remember past conflicts and to stand against what he called disguised forms of domination. The phrase acts of bullying was widely read as a critique of US military presence in the Indo-Pacific, as well as Washington's backing of legal and diplomatic challenges to China's territorial claims. Within the forum, delegates shifted in their seats as Dong's comments echoed across the hall. Analysts present remarked that the minister's rhetoric aligned with Beijing's recent diplomatic push to rally support from Southeast Asian states by positioning China as a victim of unfair Western pressure rather than as an aggressor. The sharpest part of Dong's address came when he turned to the subject of maritime disputes, an issue at the core of rising tensions in Asia. With the South China Sea dispute simmering, Beijing used the forum to reassert its long-standing position. Dong Jun declared, "The so-called freedom of navigation advocated by certain countries outside the region and the so-called international arbitration advocated by certain claimants blatantly challenge the fundamental norms of international relations. China's safeguarding of its territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests in accordance with the law is a firm defence of the post-war order and international rule of law." This remark was unmistakably aimed at the United States and its allies, who regularly conduct freedom of navigation operations in disputed waters, as well as at Southeast Asian countries like the Philippines, which have sought arbitration rulings against China's sweeping maritime claims. By framing its territorial defence as a protection of the post-war order, Beijing sought to flip the narrative. Where Washington argues that China is undermining international law, Dong presented China's actions as the very opposite, a legitimate defense of sovereignty and global legal norms. The Xiangshan Forum has become a symbolic stage where China pushes back against US-led narratives. This year's edition, featuring high-level delegates from Russia, ASEAN and Myanmar, reinforced the impression of a multipolar front coalescing against what they perceive as Western dominance. Russian Deputy Defence Minister Anna Tsivilyova's presence was particularly notable. Her handshake with delegates and her speech underscored Moscow's alignment with Beijing, especially as both countries face growing Western sanctions and criticism. Meanwhile, ASEAN's Secretary-General and Myanmar's Defence Minister highlighted Southeast Asia's central role in the evolving security dynamic. For many attendees, the forum was less about solutions and more about signalling alignments and opposition. Dong Jun's remarks crystallized Beijing's foreign policy narrative that China seeks peace but is being provoked by external powers. The speech also revealed how Beijing continues to frame legal and diplomatic disputes as illegitimate tools wielded by outsiders to contain its rise. Critics, however, argue that such rhetoric obscures China's own assertiveness. By rejecting arbitration and dismissing freedom of navigation as a pretext, Beijing positions itself against widely recognized interpretations of international maritime law. Yet for the Chinese audience and its partners in attendance, Dong's words were a rallying cry. They reinforced China's stance that it is both a defender of global order and a target of unwarranted pressure.
Dong Jun emphasized that the Chinese military is willing to work with all military.
By General Pan Dong for your service.
Году президентом России инициатива формирования архитектуры.
And to notice the staff, and please state your identity. Representatives have made excellent remarks on strengthening global governance.
Ideological device. ASEAN has transformed former front lines into open markets.
Myanmar, Minister of Defense of Myanmar. General.
当前世界正面临百年未有之大变局。
The world is currently facing profound changes unseen in a century. While the themes of the times, peace and development, remain unchanged, the gloom of a Cold War mentality, hegemonism and protectionism lingers on, even turning the legacy of World War II into a tool for geopolitical games.
遗产变成了地缘博弈的工具。
World peace faces new threats and challenges. Historical memory must serve as a constant warning to recognize and oppose hegemonic logic and acts of bullying that are disguised in a new form. Peace and justice should be safeguarded with full strength.
改头换面的霸权逻辑和霸凌行径，全力守护和平与正义。
The so-called freedom of navigation advocated by certain countries outside the region and the so-called international arbitration advocated by certain claimants blatantly challenge the fundamental norms of international relations. China's safeguarding of its territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests in accordance with the law is a firm defense of the post-war order and international rule of law.
领土主权和海洋权益，正是对战后秩序和国际法治的坚定捍卫。